No threat, no crime, just a 74-year-old black woman moving slow at an ATM. And Officer Brent Holloway shoved a gun in her face. "Who do you think you are, blocking the way?" he barked, yanking her purse and tossing it to the curb. She didn't scream. She just pulled out her phone and said, "Malcolm, come get your mother." He smirked, thinking she was powerless. Minutes later, her son pulled up, a federal prosecutor with the authority to end his career on the spot. Watch till the end to see what happens when someone abuses power and finally meets someone who can take it all away. Lucille Garner stood near the third service window of the bank, barely steady on her feet. She was 76. Her spine slightly curved, her breathing shallow but quiet. In her hands she clutched a wrinkled envelope, its seal partially torn, as her fingers trembled to open it. Her glasses slid slightly down the bridge of her nose, and she paused often to adjust them as she tried to read the blurred ink on the paper inside. She wore a thin beige coat, too light for the winter air still leaking through the front doors. Her shoes were old but polished, her gray hair neatly pulled back, clipped in place with a single rusted barrette. Behind her, the line swelled. A child sighed dramatically. A man coughed with exaggerated impatience. The bank teller gave a tight professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. After what seemed like an eternity, Lucille fished out the necessary identification with the care of someone handling sacred artifacts. Her lips moved slightly as she counted the papers under her breath, but before she could finish, a sharp buzz sounded through the air. The security guard, tall and well-fed, with sleeves rolled up above thick forearms, stood by the wall panel and pressed a button again, deliberate, slow, as if to make a point. A red light blinked above the entrance, and the low murmur in the room softened to a held breath. The front door swung open, letting in a gust of cold wind and the heavy boots of Officer Kyle Renner. His uniform was crisp, but his face looked like it hadn't slept in weeks, his jaw clenched tight beneath a week-old stubble, eyes scanning the room with bored contempt. He walked in like a man used to being feared, not questioned. As he reached the middle of the floor, no one spoke. Even the child stopped sighing. He didn't ask who called, didn't ask what the issue was. His eyes landed on Lucille, small, slow, unimportant. His voice cut through the space like broken glass. "This isn't a soup kitchen." Lucille turned, confused, startled more by the tone than the words. She adjusted her glasses again, her mouth parting to speak, but Kyle was already stepping forward. He nudged the leg of the chair she'd been leaning on, not hard, but with enough force to startle her into standing. The metal scraped against the tile with a screech, drawing stares. Kyle didn't offer his hand. He just watched her with a practiced indifference. Lucille tried to gather her documents. She bent down slowly, knees cracking audibly, fingers reaching for the papers now scattered like dead leaves across the floor. Each motion took effort. Her body did not protest with loud pain, just quiet resistance. She had bent like this many times in life, picking up after children, husbands, and employers. But this was different. This was being watched, just erased. As she reached for the last page, Kyle's hand came down, not gently, on her wrist. His grip was firm, not enough to bruise, but enough to announce authority. "Still breathing? Then move." His tone was colder than the wind outside, coated in a disdain that didn't care to be hidden. Lucille didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't look up. She just nodded once, barely perceptible, and tried to straighten her back. But her shoulder trembled under his grip, and her other hand still clutched a corner of the document, creased now, stained by her sweat. The bank lobby remained silent. The teller had already returned to her screen. The security guard stepped back, folding his arms. The child was whisked away by his mother, who whispered something about not looking. Phones hovered in hands, ready but unsure. Shame held in digital hesitation. The chair Lucille had stood from remained where it was, cold, metal, bolted to the floor. It was made for waiting, but not for dignity. She had sat there like an inconvenience, and now it stood empty, like a judgment. No one offered it again. Kyle released her wrist, but didn't step back. His presence loomed over her like a shadow with a badge. He did not explain, no instructions, only the silent implication that she had overstayed her welcome, not just in the bank, but maybe in the world. His eyes never softened. There was no flicker of doubt, no internal conflict, just mechanical disdain. Lucille moved as she was told, her steps slow but sure, one foot forward, then the other. Her papers remained on the floor. No one bent down to pick them up. Kyle didn't allow her the time. She passed the teller window, then the security desk, then the polished brass sign listing customer service hours. Every step was observed, not with concern but with relief, as if her departure would restore balance. The smell of the bank, cold air mixed with floor cleaner and ink, clung to her clothes. She didn't look back. Her face, lined by time and effort, held no expression. She had known shame before. This was something colder. Kyle walked just behind her, close enough that she could hear his breath, but far enough not to touch. A deliberate distance. His boots clicked against the tile, echoing off marble. He didn't rush her, didn't shove. He didn't have to. The message was already clear. She was not wanted here. Outside, the wind greeted them again, biting through her thin coat. The world continued as if nothing had happened. Traffic hummed. A bus hissed to a stop. Somewhere, someone laughed. Inside, the iron chair still waited, silent, immovable, and empty. Lucille Garner had entered that bank like a customer. She left like a problem solved. And Kyle Renner never once asked her name. She left the bank without a name, but not without a mark. The door hadn't even closed behind her when Kyle reached into the pocket of his belt and pulled out a pair of plastic restraints. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. With the casualness of someone tightening a shoelace, he grabbed Lucille's wrists and yanked them behind her back. Her shoulders jolted as the cold plastic bit into her skin. Her bones, thinner than they looked, strained under the sudden tension. She gasped. Not dramatically, not begging. Just a sharp, involuntary sound torn from the lungs of someone whose body had not been prepared for this brand of cruelty. Kyle leaned forward, his breath hot and sour against her ear. There, that should remind you you're still alive. The words slithered out like a dare, as if pain were the only proof of existence worth offering to someone like her. His tone wasn't raised. It was worse than loud. It was calm. Practiced, venom delivered with a smile. The street outside was watching but not moving. A man in a suit pulled out his phone, then looked away. A mother pulled her child closer, as if Lucille were contagious. Eyes darted to the scene and back to their shoes. Silence ballooned in the air like a fog no one wanted to inhale. The city had seen worse. That was the comfort they gave themselves as they allowed this to happen. Kyle began to walk, dragging her through the front plaza like a shopping cart with a broken wheel. Her feet scraped against the concrete. Her wrists jerked with every step. The cord of the plastic ties sliced deeper into her skin with each tug. Her frame swayed with the movement, not like a dancer, but like a threadbare curtain in a house with no doors. Her spine curved forward under the weight of humiliation. Her face pointed down, not because she was guilty, but because the world had decided she should be. The revolving glass doors spun open again behind them, and the sterile air of the bank spilled out like judgment. Kyle's grip on her arm tightened, not for security, but for theater. He wanted her to feel like an object, and he wanted everyone else to see it. A body in motion, a burden in plastic, a problem relocated, not resolved. As they crossed the lobby, every pair of eyes flicked toward them, then immediately turned elsewhere. The man holding his phone, now filmed from the waist, cowardice disguised as documentation. The tellers stared straight ahead, their hands moving on keyboards they weren't typing on. One woman blinked rapidly, as if blinking fast enough might make Lucy. Another nodded to herself, a subtle tick of justification. This is protocol. This is not about race. This is not about age. This is not about worth. This is about order. Lucille didn't cry. Her lips tightened into a line too thin to be called a mouth. Her shoulders drooped, not from fear, but fatigue. Her head didn't shake, it didn't hang. It simply existed in the space between surrender and resistance. Her eyes scanned the floor. She refused to look up. There was nothing up there for her, only judgment and neckties and indifference behind glasses. Kyle leaned in again, his voice lower now, poisonous and precise. "You know what you are to me?" His mouth twisted into a grin that didn't belong on any human face. "You're a handful of old dust. That's all." His words didn't stab. They carved. Deep, slow, brutal. He wanted her to bleed dignity, not blood. That was his specialty. They reached the far side of the bank where the exit spilled into the street. The glass glinted under the fluorescent lights, turning the space into a stage. Everyone watching? No one acting. But then came a pause, a breath caught in time. A child stood near the door, maybe 8 years old, ponytail crooked, eyes wide and waiting. The girl looked up at Lucille with a kind of confusion that only innocence can afford. Not pity, not fear, just a soft, puzzled question written in her gaze. Why? Lucille's eyes met the child's, just for a second, and in that fraction of a heartbeat something flickered. Not hope, not pride, just a quiet, resolute understanding. The kind of look only someone who has lived too long in the shadow of silence can give to someone who hasn't learned how loud silence can be. Lucille didn't speak. Her mouth stayed shut, but her expression whispered a message no court transcript could capture. "This isn't right, and you know it." Kyle saw the exchange. He laughed, not loudly, but cruelly. "That?" he barked, jerking his head toward the child. "That's you in 50 years, if she doesn't learn to shut her mouth early." His words were airless, final, not a warning, a sentence. The child flinched. Her mother pulled her aside quickly, shielding her like she'd been exposed to a disease. But Lucille didn't move. Her wrists ached. Her shoulders screamed. Her pride lay somewhere behind them on the bank floor, scattered between torn documents and dropped stairs. But her gaze didn't lower. Not this time. Not now. Kyle pushed open the door, dragging her into the wind. The cold hit like a slap, but it was still kinder than him. Horns honked. A bus exhaled smoke into the air. Life resumed, as if nothing had just happened. And maybe, to the world, nothing had. Just a tired woman in cuffs. Just an officer doing his job. Just another moment where justice was outnumbered. But inside that lobby, the iron chair still stood, unused, unmoved, waiting for the next person whose body was allowed to sit, but whose dignity was not. And outside, Lucille walked, tied and silent, like a page being torn out of a book before anyone had the chance to read it. She moved like an echo, trailing behind Kyle's towering presence, her steps pulled forward by the pressure of his grip more than by her own will. The precinct loomed ahead, its exterior cold and clinical, a cube of fluorescent silence and power-pressed uniforms. Inside, time felt vacuum-sealed, the air heavier, the light too white, the quiet too sharp. The glass doors yawned open and swallowed them whole. No one spoke. As they entered, the desk sergeant barely lifted his eyes. The click of Kyle's boots was the only announcement he needed. He walked with the leisure of ownership, past signs demanding respect, past posters that promised fairness. At the end of the hallway, a dull gray door waited. He opened it with one hand, shoved Lucille through with the other. She didn't stumble. Not quite, but the plastic cuffs pulled against her wrists, jerking her spine forward, as if even her bones were being disciplined. The room they entered was not an interrogation room, not a cell, but something colder, a space designed for discomfort. The metal chair at the center had no cushion, no back support, no warmth. It was a chair in shape only. Its purpose was not to seat, but to punish. Kyle forced her down without ceremony. Her body met the chair with a dull clang, and for a moment, everything went still. Then came the typing. One finger, just one. Kyle didn't type like a man in a hurry. He struck each key like it owed him something. Tap, tap, tap. Deliberate, dominant. The screen in front of him glowed with a report slowly unfolding. Subject, female, elderly. Causing public disruption, potential signs of agitation, refused to vacate private premises when directed. There were no quotations, no context, just a string of assumptions dressed as facts. Lucille sat silently. Her wrists now rested on her lap, cuffed. Her spine was straight but not defiant. Her knees were close together, her feet planted. The angle of her neck, the set of her jaw, it was all still. But the stillness wasn't surrender. It was a calculation, conservation. The silence of someone who knows speaking won't change the rules of the game, only the volume of her punishment. She waited. The air buzzed with a mechanical hum, the kind that hides in walls and ceilings, always just loud enough to distract, but never loud enough to name. Kyle continued to type. His expression didn't shift, but the tension in his face made his contempt feel sculpted. This wasn't new to him. This was routine that made it worse. Finally, Lucille spoke. Not loud, not broken, just enough. "May I call my son?" Her voice didn't shake with emotion. It trembled only from the strain of age and the ache in her shoulder. But beneath that softness was steel, quiet and unyielding. Kyle didn't look up right away. He let the question hang in the air like a joke everyone was waiting to laugh at. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes narrowed, his mouth curved upward into a smirk so precise it seemed rehearsed. "Your son?" he repeated. His tone dipped in mockery. "Tell you what, the day I see him walk in here wearing blue, badge on his chest, is the day I'll care who he is." He leaned closer. "Until then, he's just the son of a perp, like you." The words weren't shouted. That wasn't Kyle's style. He didn't need volume. He had venom. He didn't argue, he judged. His voice was weighted with a boot, and he knew exactly how to use it. It wasn't enough to deny her dignity. He wanted her to agree with her dehumanization. Lucille didn't respond. She didn't flinch. Her silence was not weakness, it was a wall, and that enraged him more than if she had cried. At the edge of the room, a younger officer stood awkwardly. Barely more than a trainee. His hands fidgeted with a paper cup. He looked at Lucille with something dangerously close to humanity. Then, without speaking, he walked over to the water dispenser, filled the cup, and approached the table. His fingers trembled slightly as he placed the cup in front of her. Kyle moved faster than expected. One hand swept the cup off the table, water sloshing across the floor, the plastic rolling under the bench. He didn't look at the rookie. He didn't have to. His voice, still calm, sliced the air. "She's used to drinking what society wastes. She doesn't need more." The rookie stepped back. His eyes dropped. The water on the floor glistened under the light like something holy spilled. Lucille didn't move. She didn't reach for the water. She didn't thank the officer. Her silence grew thicker, heavier. It wasn't forgiveness. It was an indictment. Kyle sat back down, returned to his typing. He pressed the keys harder now, more clipped, like he was trying to hurt the computer. He didn't speak again, but the room throbbed with the absence of speech. Everything else was too loud. The hum of the lights, the drag of a boot on tile, the sound of breath too tightly held. Lucille breathed quietly through her nose, each inhale measured, each exhale controlled. Her posture didn't change. Her body may have been confined, but her dignity was not something that could be cuffed. Across from her, Kyle was boiling, but without a flame. His words had not worked. His grip had not broken her. He had pulled all his usual levers: public shame, institutional power, psychological cuts. And yet, she had not collapsed. She had simply endured. That, more than defiance, was intolerable. The chair beneath Lucille groaned slightly as she shifted. She was not uncomfortable. She was simply waiting for the moment to end. But in doing so, she rewrote what that moment meant. She was not loud, but she was present. She was not asking for justice, but she was demanding to be seen. And Kyle, for all his badges and boots, could not make her disappear. He could bind her wrists. He could control the paper trail. He could write her into the system as an issue to be resolved, but he could not silence the weight of her existence. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to cry. She didn't even need to speak again, because her voice was already louder than anything he had to say. The silence was thicker now, not the silence of absence, but the silence of something held back, something waiting, like a taut string trembling before the release. Lucille remained seated, her hands still bound, her wrists aching in that dull, persistent way that feels less like pain and more like erasure. Kyle, across from her, resumed his work, if it could be called that. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, not typing now, just drumming a rhythm of impatience against the plastic keys, like a man waiting for someone else to crack first. But Lucille didn't break. She shifted slightly in her chair, adjusted her balance, and leaned forward just enough to lift her bound hands toward the table. Her fingers, bruised and stiff, reached toward the desk phone. Kyle noticed immediately. "What are you doing?" His voice sliced the air like a thrown knife, quick, flat, and sharp. She didn't answer. She didn't ask for permission. Her fingers fumbled with the receiver, her nails clicking against the smooth black plastic as she lifted it, held it to her ear with difficulty. Her hand shook, not from fear, but from the sheer strain of navigating the call through plastic bindings and gravity. She pressed the numbers one by one, slow, deliberate, precise. Her thumb hovered over the last digit for a half-second, as if remembering something older than the keypad itself. Kyle didn't stop her. He just leaned back in his chair and smiled, a cruel, smug thing stretched tight across his face. His voice dropped lower, amused. "Calling your lawyer, huh?" His eyes gleamed with the pleasure of the moment, the mockery just beneath the surface. "Sweetheart, you'd have better luck calling God. He's got more jurisdiction than whatever bleeding heart suit you've got on speed dial." Lucille didn't flinch. The call connected. A low, steady ringing echoed in the earpiece. Once, twice, 3 times, then a click. She said just one word, "Malcolm, Precinct 7. Then she hung up. No explanation, no plea, no stammering apology for bothering anyone. Just a name and a location, like coordinates etched into stone, like an invocation whispered into a storm. The weight of the word didn't lie in its volume. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was spoken the way prayers are spoken when no one else is listening. Kyle stared at her for a second, then let out a bark of laughter, so sudden it bounced off the walls like a gunshot in a church. He slapped the desk with an open palm, genuinely entertained. "That's it?" he laughed. "That's all you've got?" He grabbed the phone, checked the last number dialed, and snorted. "No name drop? No threat? You are old school." He looked at the number again, memorized it, then tossed the phone to the far side of the desk with a lazy flick. It hit the edge, bounced, and landed with a thud near a stack of forms. "Your Malcolm better show up in a cape and tights, lady, or at least bring a camera crew." Lucille didn't reply. Her gaze remained forward, fixed, not at him, not at the floor, not at the door, somewhere else. Somewhere past the room, past the sound of the fluorescent buzz, past the chill of the metal chair. Kyle leaned in, narrowed his eyes. "Nothing else to say?" he sneered. "Come on, you had all that drama in the bank. Where's that attitude now?" Still, she said nothing. But something had changed. There was no longer fear behind her stillness. No longer the kind of quiet that hopes not to be noticed. This silence was waiting. This silence knew something he didn't. Her face held no triumph, no smirk, just presence. Kyle didn't like it. He leaned back again, harder this time, his chair creaking under his weight. He ran a hand through his short hair, irritation creeping behind his eyes. He wanted her rattled, not ready, wanted her wilted, not watchful. She wasn't supposed to look like someone who had planted a seed. She was supposed to look like someone buried. The seconds ticked by. Lucille closed her eyes for a moment, just a breath, just enough to pull something deep back into herself. It was not rest, it was preparation. On the desk, the forms Kyle had started filling out sat untouched now. The fields blank, the ink still trapped in his pen. The air had thickened, not with heat, not with tension, but with inevitability. Kyle rose suddenly. He needed movement, noise, control. "I've got better things to do than babysit ghosts," he muttered under his breath. He kicked the edge of the desk as he turned toward the hallway, mumbling something to no one in particular. His boots echoed down the corridor. Lucille remained. Still tied, still silent, still waiting. The silence she had wrapped herself in did not protect her. It provoked him. Kyle returned after minutes that moved like broken clock hands, no longer laughing, amused. Something about her stillness had unsettled him, made him feel watched by something more ancient than the law, something he couldn't report or cuff or write off in a report. Without a word, he reached down, grabbed Lucille's elbow and yanked her to her feet. The metal chair screeched against the tile as her weight left it. Her knees buckled slightly, not from fear, not from weakness, but from the strain of hours spent frozen in place. She said nothing, but her breath caught in her chest, sharp and sudden, like a splinter buried too deep. It didn't take the elevator. There was one behind them, gleaming, untouched, humming quietly like a secret exit, but Kyle led her past it toward the stairwell. Concrete steps, no railing on one side, light flickering like a warning no one ever fixed. The hallway swallowed the sound of the rest of the precinct. It was narrow, colder than the rest of the building. Each step groaned beneath their weight. Lucille's feet dragged. Her shoulder twisted awkwardly each time he pulled. Her balance, already fragile, faltered. She tried to match his pace, to keep from stumbling, but her body had its rhythm now. An older rhythm, one that refused to be rushed. Halfway up the second flight, her foot missed the edge of a step. She crumpled. There was no dramatic fall, just the soft, horrifying slump of flesh against concrete, the hiss of skin catching rough stone. Her knees hit first, then her hip. Her palms, still bound, couldn't catch her. She landed forward, breath knocked out of her in a stuttered gasp. Her head came inches from the wall, her face pressed into the cold step. Dust clung to her cheek. Kyle didn't pause, didn't help, didn't ask. He looked down at her like she was a wet newspaper tossed into the wind. "You all right down there?" he said, the words dripping with theatrical concern. "Need a break?" Lucille tried to lift herself. Her arms were behind her. Her knees burned. Her shoulders screamed. Each inhale scraped through her chest like broken glass. She coughed, once, twice, sharp and dry. Kyle leaned over, bent down just enough for his words to find her ear. "Sounds like those lungs are finally giving out. Guess that civil rights era air wasn't as clean as you thought, huh?" The words should have landed like a slap, but Lucille didn't look at him. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment. Then she moved inch by inch, pushing herself to her feet without his help. Her bones protested, her spine arched with pain, her mouth remained shut. Kyle watched her rise, and for the briefest second something in his face flickered. Not empathy, never that, but confusion. Confusion at the way she got up, not like someone defying him, but like someone who had stood up like this 1,000 times before. From the hallway above, another officer appeared, a younger man, fresh-faced, eyes wide. He saw Lucille, the stairs, the cuffs, the bruised knees. He stepped forward, uncertain. "Kyle," he said, maybe you should shut your mouth," Kyle snapped. His voice echoed off the stairwell, loud and sharp. The young officer froze. Kyle's eyes narrowed, his body angled forward like a dog guarding a meal. "Unless you want to take the ride with her," he hissed, "I suggest you walk away." The younger man stepped back, his hands curled into fists, then released, his mouth opened, then closed. He turned and vanished without a sound. Lucille reached the top step. She didn't look back. The hallway there was worse, shorter, darker, buzzing with the sick hum of failing lights. Kyle pushed the door open with a shoulder, guided her inside with a shove that was more insult than force. The holding room smelled like bleach and metal and sweat. The walls were off-white, in the way neglected places always are, yellowing at the corners, stained in ways no one bothered to fix. A neon bulb above flickered on and off, casting strobe-like pulses that made the room feel alive, angry, like it was breathing, shallow, fast, and hateful. Kyle shoved her toward a bench bolted to the floor. She sat without protest. Her wrists ached. Her spine was on fire. The cold from the floor crept up through her shoes, into her ankles, her legs, her chest. It wasn't the temperature. It was the message. She was not a person here. She was delayed, a disruption, a weight to be managed until forgotten. Kyle stood at the door for a moment, hand on the knob, but he didn't open it. Instead, he turned back to her, and for the first time, his voice dropped below performance. "You know what you are to me?" he whispered. Lucille looked up. Not far, just enough. Kyle leaned in. "You're the nightmare I have at the end of a long day. You're the last thing I see before I sleep. Not because you scare me, because you're still here." Then he turned and left. The door slammed shut. The bulb above her blinked again, once, twice, and then stayed on. The light above her head stayed on, but it flickered inside her lungs. Lucille sat unmoving on the cold bench, her hands still cuffed, her breath shallow but even, each exhale a quiet rejection of the room's purpose. She had no clock, but her body measured time through the pulse in her wrists and the weight in her chest. She waited, not in despair, not in defeat, but in certainty. Then the hallway stirred, not with footsteps trying to dominate the floor, not with the slam of impatient doors or the bark of unnecessary orders. This sound was different, measured, crisp, deliberate. The cadence of someone who did not need to announce his authority because he brought it with him, stitched into the thread of his suit and carried in the rhythm of his breath. The door opened. He stepped in. Malcolm Garner wore a slate-gray suit that didn't shout wealth, but whispered preparation. His tie was straight, his shoes were silent, his eyes alert. He didn't blink more than needed, didn't move more than necessary. He had the stillness of a man trained to see the trap before stepping forward. And when he spoke, his voice didn't rise above the noise. It made the room quieter. "I'm here for Lucille Garner," he said. "I'm her attorney." Kyle looked up from his desk, already mid-scoff. His posture sagged into the back of his chair. His legs spread just enough to imply dominance. His chin lifted like someone waiting to be amused. "Attorney," he said, dragging the word like gum stuck to his boot. "Let me guess. Public defender with a soft spot for geriatrics?" Malcolm didn't flinch. "No," he said evenly. "Private, federal bar, Civil Rights Division, Harvard Law, and," he paused, just enough, "her son." Kyle blinked, the smile freezing for a split second. Then it returned, uglier. "Lawyer and offspring? Wow." Double the disappointment. Malcolm stepped forward, not fast, not aggressive, but absolutely without hesitation. He set his leather briefcase on the desk, flipped it open with surgical precision, and produced a document. Not many pages. Just enough. He placed it flat on the table. "This is legal confirmation of my representation. You'll find a writ of immediate release, authorization for medical inspection, and a notice of intent to pursue civil redress." Kyle didn't touch it right away. He stared at Malcolm, trying to decide which insult to throw first. Then, with exaggerated disinterest, he picked up the document, skimmed it, then let it fall from his fingers like a napkin after a bad meal. The pages slid off the edge of the desk and landed on the floor. Malcolm didn't react. He didn't reach down. He didn't blink. Kyle leaned back again. "You know what's funny?" he said. "You walk in here all sharp and polished, thinking that means something, thinking suits change the rules. But in here, paper means less than attitude. And your little stack of legalese doesn't buy her an ounce of mercy." Malcolm turned his head slightly, looked at him fully for the first time, not with anger, not with disdain, but with complete clarity. "You don't have to respect me," he said, voice even, controlled. "You probably won't. I'm used to that. But understand this. Whether you like it or not, you will learn to fear my mother." The words landed like a door closing behind Kyle. He blinked again, not because of the volume, because of the precision. Malcolm didn't say it as a threat. He didn't say it as a boast. He said it like a fact. Already written, already happening, already irreversible. For a second, the room held its breath. Kyle stood slowly, still trying to command the space with size, with swagger, but it didn't work the same way anymore. Malcolm wasn't challenging him. He was outlasting him. "You think this is some movie scene?" Kyle sneered. "You think a few papers and a speech make you some hero?" "No," Malcolm said. "I think showing up makes me her son." There was nothing else to add. The rest of the moment belonged to silence. The silence Malcolm left in the air didn't fade. It thickened. Kyle stood there, staring, but the room no longer answered to him. Malcolm adjusted the cuff of his suit with a subtle flick of his wrist, then reached into his briefcase once more. This time he didn't pull out papers. He pulled out weight, 6 thick folders, marked, sealed, and tabbed. The sound of them hitting the desk was dull, but it landed like thunder. He didn't need to raise his voice. "These are the names," Malcolm said, his tone flat, unwavering. 6 individuals, 6 complaints, all linked to you, all buried. Kyle scoffed, rolling his eyes, but his posture shifted by inches. "Oh, yeah?" he said. "Let me guess. Bunch of thugs with records as thick as those files. You think I'm losing sleep over crackheads and repeat offenders?" Malcolm didn't blink. He opened the first file, an unarmed teenager with a broken jaw, arrested for loitering, never charged. He opened the second, a man in his 50s, slammed against a cruiser door, suffered a fractured rib, accused of interfering with an investigation because he asked you not to curse at his wife. The third, a 21-year-old woman, no criminal history, left with bruises on her throat after a verbal disagreement during a traffic stop. Kyle's jaw twitched. "They all had it coming. You weren't there. You don't know the streets." Malcolm's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I know the law." He opened the fourth file. "You restrained a 16-year-old by the neck. Claim he lunged. Video showed otherwise. Complaint filed, vanished within a week." The fifth, a man with epilepsy, slammed to the pavement while seizing. No weapon. You wrote that he was resisting. The sixth, a pregnant woman. You threw her against a vending machine. Her charges were dismissed. Yours weren't filed. Kyle reached for one of the folders, grabbed it, and flipped through the pages like they were trash mail. "This is all one-sided?" he muttered. "You lawyers cherry-pick what fits your little narrative." Malcolm didn't interrupt. He let the statement hang, then slowly quoted from the Penal Code. "Prior convictions do not void a citizen's civil rights. Use of force must be proportional. Racial bias in enforcement is grounds for review under federal scrutiny." Kyle slammed the folder shut. "I didn't do anything illegal. I followed protocol." "Protocol doesn't authorize assault," Malcolm replied, his tone still clinical. "It doesn't authorize humiliation. It doesn't legalize pattern-based brutality." Kyle stood abruptly, knocking the remaining files to the floor. Pages spilled out, fanned across the tile. Photos, statements, incident reports, names, dates. Malcolm didn't move. He didn't flinch. He let the silence sharpen. Kyle looked down at the mess on the floor. "You gonna pick that up?" he sneered. Malcolm's gaze didn't shift. "The truth doesn't need to be picked up," he said quietly. "It stands on its own." The words didn't echo. They settled, final, irrefutable. Kyle didn't answer, because there was nothing left to say. The files lay scattered across the floor, but Malcolm didn't reach down to collect them. He had already delivered the weight they carried. He turned without another word and walked out of the room, not because he had nothing left to say, but because Kyle had nothing left to answer. Down the corridor, the air shifted again, tighter, more coiled, as if the building itself understood the reckoning crawling into its bone. At the far end of the precinct, past a locked glass door and a sign that read "Authorized Personnel Only," was a room that rarely hosted visitors. Its light was different, less fluorescent, more surgical. Its windows, narrow and high, seemed designed not to let light in, but to keep scrutiny out. In the center of that room sat the coldest chair in the entire building, not because of the metal it was made of, but because of the man who sat across from it, the lieutenant. His name wasn't spoken often. He didn't bark orders. He didn't patrol hallways. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His authority came not from presence, but from inertia. He had always been there, immovable, untouchable, an architect of quiet compliance. His uniform was pristine. His fingers tapped slowly against the oak table, not impatient, but mechanical. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Repeat. Malcolm stepped in without invitation. He closed the door behind him gently, then crossed the room and took the seat opposite the lieutenant. He did not offer a handshake. He did not smile. The lieutenant stopped tapping. Silence filled the space like water flooding a sealed room. Neither man moved. Malcolm opened his briefcase again. This time there were no stacks, no files, no waves of documents. Just one folder, slim, clean, tied closed with a single black ribbon. He placed it on the table and slid it forward with one finger. The lieutenant glanced at it, but didn't touch it. Malcolm spoke first. "Every second you stay silent," he said, "is a declaration. You don't have to speak to pick a side. You already have." The lieutenant's expression didn't shift. He studied Malcolm like a man watching the wind move a tree, knowing it was real, but refusing to name its direction. "I've never seen Kyle break procedure," the lieutenant said finally, voice soft, almost bored. "That's the truth." Malcolm's eyes didn't waver. "Then you've never looked hard enough." The lieutenant's hand stilled. The tapping stopped. Malcolm leaned forward slightly. Not aggressive, not pleading, just calibrated for impact. "Your job is not to protect perception. It's to protect people. You don't get to claim ignorance when you were handed proof and looked away." The lieutenant exhaled once through his nose, slow and quiet. "You're emotional." "No," Malcolm said. "I'm prepared." The lieutenant finally reached out and pulled the folder closer. He opened it. On top was a single photo, not from bruises, not of blood, not of violence, just an image. Lucille Garner, cuffed, head bowed, hair disheveled, knees together, wrists were tight behind her back, face turned away as if the camera wasn't worth acknowledging. The photo said everything. The lieutenant stared at it longer than he meant to. Then he closed the folder and slid it back. "Do what you have to do," he said, but his voice cracked just enough to reveal he knew it was already being done. Malcolm stood. He didn't threaten. He didn't explain. He left the folder on the table, and the lieutenant didn't touch it again. The room remained still, but the silence had changed sides. Malcolm walked out of the precinct without speaking to anyone. He didn't need to. He had already left behind something louder than any voice could offer. By the time he reached his car, the weight of what he'd carried in was already shifting into motion. He didn't turn the key right away. Instead, he opened his phone, found the file, trimmed nothing, added no filters, no dramatic angles, no color correction, no music, just raw footage shot on a witness's phone. 23 seconds. Shaky, unsteady. True, it showed Lucille Garner, 76, wrists bound in plastic, being dragged across a tiled floor by a man twice her size. No context, no dialogue, just footsteps, just the scrape of her shoes, the flinch of her shoulder, the slump in her spine, the angle of her head, not bowed in shame, but yanked by force. Malcolm typed 5 words. "This is my mother," and he posted. He didn't add hashtags. He didn't tag news outlets. He didn't write a paragraph explaining systemic abuse. He didn't narrate. He didn't need to. The silence inside the video spoke for itself. The post went live at 2:14 p.m. By 3:05, it had 100,000 views. By 3:43, it hit 1 million. By 4:12, it was being shared in law school forums, black advocacy pages, and city council inboxes. It moved like a slow-building wave. No explosion, no viral stunt, just momentum. Just wait. People didn't scroll past it. They stopped, watched, rewatched, not because they were shocked, but because they weren't. By 6:02 p.m., it had crossed 18 million. No audio, no edit, just gravity. In the caption, Malcolm hadn't said she was innocent. He hadn't said she was mistreated. He hadn't even said she was abused. He had only told the world one thing, that she was his. The rest, the viewers filled in for themselves. One comment read, "If this is how they treat someone's mother in public, imagine what they do in private." Another simply wrote, "No excuse, no justification, just wrong." And then there was the professor, a scholar, retired, former dean. His post didn't tag anyone either. He just reposted the video and wrote, "I once taught men like Kyle Renner how to interpret the Constitution, and I once dismissed women like Lucille Garner as complicated cases." This video was 30 seconds long, but it took me 70 years to be ready to see it. Kyle saw it too. Someone forwarded it to him without a message. just the link. He clicked, already annoyed, already smirking. But as the video played, his expression didn't change, not right away. He watched himself, watched his hand tighten around the wrist of a woman who didn't resist, watched the way she stumbled, watched the way everyone else in the frame turned their heads. He didn't finish watching. He threw the phone against the locker behind him. The screen cracked. Silence followed. But this time, it wasn't a silence he controlled. The video could be broken on one man's screen, but it kept living everywhere else. While Kyle stood over his cracked phone, muttering justifications into the air like prayers no God would hear, the rest of the world was still watching. Not watching for entertainment, watching with the awareness that something familiar had been dragged into the light, something they'd seen shadows of for years, but now had the footage, the name, and the bloodless silence to confirm. No screaming, no shouting, just a body being pulled like it didn't belong to a person. By dawn, Malcolm was no longer just a son or a lawyer. He was an architect, and the structure he was building wasn't rhetorical. It was procedural, concrete, federal. He sat at his desk alone, the lights dimmed, the air heavy with the scent of printer toner and intention. He didn't draft statements for social media. He didn't feed sound bites to the press. He wrote law, language sharpened into a weapon. Pages as clean and sharp as a blade. Every line was a line drawn. Every clause was a match lit. He titled it plainly, Civil Complaint for Damages and Injunctive Relief. The defendant, Kyle Renner. But not just him. The real target was deeper. The entire precinct, IST, the command chain, the municipal leadership, the review board that never reviewed, the union reps who muted every grievance, the culture that protected power, not people. The lawsuit opened with a statement of jurisdiction. This wasn't a state matter, this was federal. Section 1983 of the U.S. Code. Violation of constitutional rights under color of law. The 8th and 14th Amendments. Unlawful detention, use of excessive force, deprivation of dignity. The tone was not fiery. It didn't need to be. It was surgical, precise, detached enough to pass judicial scrutiny, sharp enough to cut through stone. Attached to the lawsuit, on the very first page of the exhibits, Malcolm placed a photograph. It wasn't the viral video, not a clip, not a still from a news feed. This image had been captured intentionally, moments after Lucille had been booked and processed, when she had been forced to sit once more in that metal chair, shoulders slumped, hands still bound, spine curled from hours of degradation. Her face was turned away, but her silver hair, disheveled, tangled, spoke more than any expression could have. The shot didn't show violence, it showed the aftermath. It showed what indifference looks like after it's done feeding. No caption, no text overlay, no date, just pain in the posture. Malcolm stared at the image longer than necessary. He wasn't second-guessing. He was just remembering, not just what had happened, but what had always been possible. For years, he'd walked a narrow corridor as a black lawyer in a system that liked its blackness safe, quiet, and grateful. And every time he spoke with force, he knew people were smiling at him politely, waiting for him to trip. But this wasn't about him. It had never been. It was about the fact that a woman like his mother could be erased in plain view and people still needed proof. This was the proof. He filed the complaint at exactly 9:31 a.m., timing it so the docket would be processed before the mid-morning court rush. He didn't send it to the media himself. He didn't have to. Legal filings were public record. And there were already people watching, waiting, refreshing news feeds. By 10:22 a.m., it was on record. By 10:27, the headline had been picked up by a small local site. By 10:34, a journalist from the Washington Post had confirmed the filing. By 10:58, the hashtag Lucille Garner was trending across 4 platforms. By noon, it wasn't just a story, it was a signal fire, and the city couldn't pretend it didn't. Kyle heard the news before he read it. Because noise always travels faster than ink when it's coming for you, and the precinct didn't whisper, it watched. Eyes darted, voices paused, chairs shifted when he walked through the bullpen that morning, like heat warping the shape of a room, and he felt it, not in a headline, not in a memo, but in the way silence hung when he passed, heavier than any briefing he'd ever ignored. And when he finally saw it, his name in the black text on white paper, crisp and cruel and inescapable. He didn't read the full lawsuit, because men like him didn't need details to recognize a threat. They only needed to know someone finally dared to speak in the language they understood. Power, paper, proof. He grabbed the report from a colleague's desk, scanned the bolded line that read, "Systemic liability and personal misconduct resulting in the violation of federal civil protections," and he laughed. Short and sharp, the kind of laugh people use to keep their pulse steady. And then he threw the document back down like it hadn't just named him as the center of something bigger than violence, bigger than policy, something human. And he muttered to no one in particular, "This is bull." But even he heard the shake in his voice, so he said it again. Louder, like volume could bleach the truth. Officers turned away, not in protest, but in preservation, because proximity to collapse was dangerous, and Kyle, for all his bravado, was unraveling fast. His lips moved like they were trying to find a version of events that fit, but all that came out were fragments. She resisted, I followed protocol. They didn't see what happened before, but none of it stuck. Not even to himself, because deep down, under the ego, under the uniform, he knew what had happened. People saw what they weren't supposed to see, and now they couldn't unsee it. Someone tried to ask if he was okay, but he swatted the question away like a fly, stormed into the locker room, slammed the metal door behind him, and paced. Fists clenched, jaw tight, the air thick with a rage that couldn't find a target, because you can't punch a lawsuit. You can't choke a reputation, and you can't outshout a photograph. He pulled out his phone, checked his name online, and there it was. A flood of stories, reactions, headlines, each colder than the last. Civil rights lawsuit filed after elderly woman dragged by police. Malcolm Garner, federal attorney. Names full precinct in abuse case. Video shows 76-year-old Lucille Garner in plastic cuffs. His breath hitched. Not because of guilt, but because he was losing control. And for men like Kyle, losing control was the first real injury they ever felt. He punched the locker, dented it, again and again until his knuckles stung, but the news didn't change, the names didn't disappear, and when he finally stopped, breathing hard, blood blooming in the creases of his palm, he looked in the mirror and saw not a hero, not a soldier, but a man cracking open from the inside out. Somewhere in the building, someone was whispering his name, but not with reverence, with caution. While Kyle burned from the inside out, Lucille Garner walked into the courthouse without a single word, and that silence traveled ahead of her like a shadow, like a memory that refused to stay buried. Because this time, she didn't enter with cuffs on her wrists or shame in her posture. She entered with presence, the kind that can't be fabricated, the kind that only arrives after decades of being told, "You don't belong in places like this." She wore no armor, no makeup, no pretense. Just her coat, her cane, her breath. Her body still ached from that day, but her spine, bent as it was, carried something heavier than pain. It carried purpose, and, walking beside her, was Malcolm. Not as her spokesperson, not as her savior, but as her witness. No press conference. No statement, just a door opening into a courtroom already filled with the noise of modern justice, clacking keys, murmured speculation, security guards barking instructions with the efficiency of boredom, but all of it quieted when she crossed the threshold, because there's something about dignity when it walks into a room that makes everyone else shrink. She didn't look around, didn't search for sympathy, didn't smile for cameras. She moved straight ahead. Her steps were slow, deliberate, not defiant, but deliberate, like every inch of ground taken back was a sentence in the story no one had let her write. Malcolm said nothing. He didn't touch her. He didn't guide her. He just moved, in rhythm, letting her choose the pace. Inside, the courtroom was colder than the hallway. The lights are sterile. The air was stiff with formalities. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the weight of the system already sat heavy in every corner. Officers lined the back wall. Lawyers scribbled their last-second edits. Reporters pretended not to take notes, but it wasn't the gavel they were waiting for. It was her. Lucille reached the defense table and paused. There, waiting, was the same kind of chair she had been shoved into at the precinct. Metal, hard-edged, indifferent. She looked at it for a long moment, and then Malcolm, without a word, stepped forward, pulled it out gently, and let it sit still. She didn't rush to sit. She wasn't here to collapse. She was here to be seen, and when she did sit, the room adjusted to her, not because she asked it to, but because she demanded nothing. In that stillness, in that poise, there was something more powerful than any argument a lawyer could make. This was not a performance. It was present. She didn't glare. She didn't tremble. She didn't shrink. And for the first time since her name became a headline, the world saw not a case file, not a news item, not a clip to share, but a woman who had endured the full weight of institutional violence and still chose to face it standing. She didn't need to speak. She already had. The room held still around her. Not out of respect, not yet, but out of the instinctive recognition that something irreversible had begun. Lucille didn't need to speak for silence to obey her. She sat as if the chair had always belonged to her, not as a defendant, not even as a plaintiff, but as a mother who had weathered every storm thrown her way and still refused to drown. Malcolm stood beside her, unreadable. He didn't adjust his tie, didn't glance at his notes, didn't posture for the cameras. His power was not in performance. It was in presence, inherited and sharpened through every injustice his mother had absorbed and every law he had mastered to strike back. Across the hallway, behind a glass window, Kyle watched from a dimly lit room reserved for personnel under internal review. His uniform was gone, his posture sagged, his fists were still clenched, but not from confidence, from panic. He saw her again, not the woman he had dragged across a floor, not the file number, not the disruption. He saw her as something far worse to men like him. Undeniable. A judge entered. Proceedings began. But the words of law were only echoes in a space already defined by what could not be undone. It didn't matter what was said in that hour. The moment had already shifted, and it happened when Malcolm, without any theatrical gesture, leaned down beside the chair, whispered something into his mother's ear, words no one else heard, and extended his hand. Lucille looked at him, not with surprise, not with doubt, but with a slow, patient recognition, as if she had been waiting for this invitation her entire life. Her right hand, still stiff, still bearing the ache of plastic restraints, reached up and met his. And then she stood. No music, no applause, no declaration. Just the soft scrape of metal as the chair was pushed back and the weight of 76 years rose straight from it. The courtroom didn't erupt. It didn't need to. What happened next wasn't for show. It was truth taking form. For the first time since her arrest, since the dragging, the silence, the paperwork, the headlines, and the lawsuit, Lucille Garner stood tall. No one helped her steady herself. No one needed to. And in that instant, she was no longer a symbol. No longer just a mother, no longer just a victim of misconduct. She was justice embodied. Kyle, still behind the glass, turned away before she made eye contact. Not because he didn't want to see her, but because he couldn't. Because looking at her now would mean acknowledging every inch of what he had tried to erase. Lucille didn't flinch. She didn't even glance in his direction. She faced forward, shoulders square, chin high, and in the stillness that followed, the system that once forced her into silence was now the one without anything left to say. She didn't look back when she stepped out of the courtroom, but the world did. The moment Lucille Garner stood, unassisted, from the cold metal chair that had held her like an accusation, something broke loose. Not just in the room, not just in the city, but in the hollow silence of a system that had mistaken indifference for order. And from that break, a document emerged, black ink scorched with purpose, a civil rights lawsuit that did not name just a man, but everything that allowed him to become one. Malcolm Garner filed the suit not as a grieving son, but as a surgeon cutting open what the law had long stitched shut. It was concise, brutal, and damning, but the words alone would not have caught fire. That came with the voice. A few days after the lawsuit reached the court, an audio file surfaced, unnamed, untraceable. The sender left no note, no claim of whistleblowing. It arrived like a ticking watch slipped into the pocket of a bomb. The clip was short, the voice was clear, and the words were a confession dressed as policy. "They only understand law when it comes with pain," Kyle Renner's voice said. Casual, indifferent, unmistakably sober. "You don't earn control, you assert it. Make it hurt, they'll get the message." It wasn't yelled, it wasn't spit out in rage, it was said like weather, like a fact not worth questioning. That tone made it worse than any scream. The room around him had been silent in the recording, a closed-door precinct meeting, and at the end of his sentence someone, unidentified, let out a muted laugh, not loud, just enough to prove that he wasn't alone in the belief. Malcolm didn't flinch when it reached his ears. He didn't rush to press conferences, didn't chase a headline. He waited, measured, then a briefing was called in the courtyard of the District Federal Building. Cameras clicked, the wind shifted. Reporters expected outrage, but Malcolm brought evidence. He played the clip. No context, no edits, just Kyle's voice slicing the air. And then, when the recording stopped, Malcolm leaned forward and spoke into the mic with a calm so firm it shattered every expectation. "This is not a man misspeaking," he said. "This is a man quoting doctrine." He paused, eyes level, jaw still. "You've heard the line, a few bad apples. Let me finish it for you. Spoil the whole barrel. This isn't a barrel with one rotten apple. This is a supply chain, a culture, a training ground." He lifted the court filing. "This suit is not for one incident. This is for every officer who heard a line like that and didn't walk out of the room." Within 24 hours, major outlets stopped calling it the Lucille Garner case. They started calling it a test of systemic complicity. Think pieces were printed before the ink of the lawsuit had dried. Legal analysts dissected every word Malcolm had used. And in precincts across the country, especially the one that raised Kyle, quiet doors began to shut. Hurried meetings called, internal affairs departments pushed to issue statements that said nothing but reeked of panic. Kyle didn't respond. He was advised not to. His legal counsel insisted that public statements would only fan the fire, but Kyle was already burning, and not from what was said in court, from what had finally been heard outside of it. The irony wasn't lost on Malcolm. A man who once spat at the vulnerable was now silenced by the very system he'd weaponized. Kyle's name became not just a person, but a placeholder, a shorthand for every officer who had ever used a badge to brutalize, every precinct that called fear a strategy, every institution that confused silence with loyalty, and Malcolm made sure the country learned that name well. He compiled policy documents from over a decade, highlighted passages, circled contradictions, and released a series of annotated reports titled "The System That Built Kyle." Each was released publicly. Each included cross-references to Kyle's actions, the lack of discipline, the repeated praise in internal reviews, the glowing evaluations that said he was firm under pressure and effective at controlling disorder. It didn't take a law degree to read between the lines. What emerged wasn't just a portrait of Kyle, it was a blueprint of protection. Every time he was reported, someone called it a misunderstanding. Every time someone came forward, they were asked, "Do you have a criminal history?" Every instance was a brick, and now the wall was visible. Malcolm didn't point to it, he made others see it for themselves. He spoke in interviews with quiet clarity, never raising his voice, but his words hit like a gavel strikes. The first time he pushed someone, he said on live TV, they called it discipline. The 5th time, they called it a coincidence. The 10th time, they called it regrettable. And now, they're calling it him. But it's never just one man. It's who trained him, who defended him, who sat beside him when he said what you just heard and laughed. The city wasn't used to hearing the police described that way. Not in public, not with evidence, but now they had a face, a quote, and a lawsuit, and that trinity was louder than any denial. Kyle, now suspended, watched as his friends stopped calling, as his neighbors started whispering, as his badge became an artifact rather than a shield. His name, once written in block letters on his chest, now appeared in italics beneath the words "Federal Investigation." And still Malcolm said nothing personal. He let the facts bleed. By the third week, the silence inside the precinct wasn't a strategy, it was survival. Conversations stopped when names entered the room. Eyes no longer met during shift changes. Files went missing. Department heads stopped answering phones directly, redirecting calls to legal. Some officers took sick leave. Others quietly met with union reps. Kyle's photo, once framed proudly among service commendations in the lobby, disappeared without comment. No explanation was offered, none was needed. The wall was trying to erase the man it had once elevated. But walls don't forget, especially when they've been documented, scanned, and posted online. One internal leak turned into 3. A junior officer sent out an unsigned affidavit detailing a culture of minimization, where force reports were smoothed, language was reframed, and video evidence was deprioritized if it showed ambiguity. Ambiguity, in this context, meant a beating without enough blood. The leak ended with a single sentence that cut deeper than any accusation. "I stayed quiet because I was told that's what professionalism looked like." That line ricocheted through newsrooms and legal circles like a bullet with no target, because it hit everyone. Malcolm responded with restraint. He didn't attack. He amplified. In an op-ed published across multiple national outlets, he wrote, "This moment is not about vengeance. It is about clarity. And clarity requires confession, not just from one man, but from the machinery that allowed him to grow bolder with every bruise he left behind." He included a timeline, 12 years of Kyle's career, annotated with complaints, lack of follow-up, and the names of supervisors who signed off on each file. He didn't name them for shame, he named them for accountability. Some began to break. One former deputy chief released a personal statement. "We celebrated numbers. Tickets written, arrests made, not how people were treated. Kyle performed, so we pretended not to see what he was performing." That sentence hit local leadership like a bat through glass. Suddenly, the spotlight widened. It wasn't just Kyle anymore. It was a policy memo, budget priorities, training procedures. Review boards are packed with allies instead of advocates. A former board member confessed, anonymously, that he was pressured to keep complaint numbers low because a clean record means more funding. The city that had once stood behind its badge was now watching it from across a line. Malcolm made sure that the line stayed clear. At a town hall, when an audience member shouted, "So all cops are bad now?" Malcolm didn't flinch. He leaned into the mic and said, "No, but silence is." He let the words settle before continuing. "Good men don't stay good by staying quiet." The room erupted in applause, not because he had delivered a slogan, but because he had carved a truth too plain to ignore. Meanwhile, Kyle began showing cracks. He moved from house to house, staying with distant relatives. Every attempt to speak was intercepted by his legal team. But he grew increasingly erratic behind closed doors. Surveillance photos showed him pacing outside his old precinct late at night, staring at the building but never entering. In one clip, he smashed his fist against the driver's wheel of his truck, screaming something inaudible before speeding off. The same hands that once cuffed old women now trembled when pouring coffee. His spiral was silent but visible, an implosion of control from a man who had built his identity on dominance. The civil rights lawsuit gained momentum. A federal judge fast-tracked the proceedings, citing public interest and systemic implication. Civil society groups filed amicus briefs. 3 other cities announced audits of their police complaint systems. And still, Malcolm refused to gloat. When asked if he felt vindicated, he said, "This is not about how I feel, this is about what happens next." That sentence became a new headline. It also became a test. Who would do something next? Within departments across the country, officers began to whisper about a shift, not because their values had changed, but because now someone was watching. and not just watching, documenting. Malcolm's team launched a digital archive of excessive force cases tied to bureaucratic neglect, searchable by city and officer number. It wasn't a hit piece, it was a ledger, facts, footage, failures, and always Lucille at the center, not crying, not begging, just sitting, shackled. Still, by now, systemic complicity wasn't just a trend, it was a movement. College students painted murals, protesters held up mirrors at rallies instead of signs. A theater troupe staged a silent play reenacting Lucille's arrest, using only body language and light. No sound, just breathe, just resistance, and everywhere people repeated one line from Malcolm's now viral speech, "You don't reform a wall by repainting it. You replace the bricks." Kyle watched from obscurity, a ghost still wrapped in flesh. His name was spoken more than ever, just never with honor, and Malcolm didn't need to say another word. He had already said enough. It ended not with sirens or shouting, but with a signature, a single black-inked flourish beneath a 32-page federal resolution that named, line by line, the failings of an entire department. The ruling called Kyle's behavior egregious, but what made headlines was what followed, and enabled by a consistent pattern of internal indifference and deliberate inaction. That phrase shattered the last layer of plausible deniability. The institution wasn't simply caught off guard, it had been complicit. And now it was branded as such in a ruling that couldn't be appealed away or spun into irrelevance. Within hours, the city council held an emergency session. Resignations followed. Not one, but 6 officials stepped down. The review board chair, the deputy chief of personnel, the legal affairs liaison, and 3 senior officers who had signed off on Kyle's most disputed reports. It wasn't a domino effect, it was an avalanche. The mayor, who had once posted selfies with uniformed officers, now stood behind a podium with bags under his eyes and a script in his hands. "We failed, Mrs. Garner. We failed this community, and we will not pretend otherwise." It wasn't an apology. It was a eulogy for a credibility that had long since died, but was only now being buried. Kyle, meanwhile, was summoned to a closed federal deposition. The footage wasn't public, but a leaked transcript captured the moment his lawyer asked him, "Do you regret what you did to Mrs. Garner?" The pause lasted 11 seconds, then Kyle said, "I regret getting caught on camera." That line went viral within minutes. It wasn't just damning, it was confirmation. The man wasn't broken. He was exposed, and the world saw it not as an outburst, but as the final nail sealing a coffin built by his own hands. In a national broadcast later that week, Malcolm was asked whether justice had been served. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. He simply replied, "Justice isn't something you serve like a plate. It's something you build, brick by painful brick." He looked straight into the lens and added, "And you don't build it on silence." That clip was replayed by universities, quoted by senators, and shared across continents, not because it was eloquent, but because it was undeniable. The phrase Lucille's Law began surfacing across think tanks and policy circles. Proposed legislation aimed to require mandatory third-party reviews of all excessive force complaints, coupled with public access digital archives. Malcolm helped draft the language, but insisted on one clause above all: no incident shall be considered closed unless the complainant is addressed by name. That clause wasn't bureaucratic, it was personal. It rewrote the rule book on dignity. Lucille never returned to the precinct. She didn't need to. Her presence lingered in every file scanned, every wall stripped of plaques, every new training session that began with the words, "Let me tell you about Mrs. Garner." Officers began to cite her story not with disdain, but with a wary respect, as a reminder that power, once misused, could become a wound that never closes. In schools, her name joined the ranks of Rosa, Fanny, and Angela, not as a symbol of victimhood, but of refusal. She never begged for mercy. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than the boots that dragged her. Her stillness became movement. Her pain became momentum. Kyle, disbarred from service and facing multiple civil penalties, disappeared from public view. The system that once protected him had now written him off its pages. His name lingered like a scar, but it was no longer feared, it was pitied, and nothing is more dangerous to a man like Kyle than being pitied. Malcolm, having delivered not just a verdict but a reckoning, didn't hold a press tour. He didn't seek a book deal. Instead, he returned to his office, opened the drawer where the original complaint had been filed, and placed a single sheet inside. On it were the words, "She was never invisible. You just refused to look." And just like that, the storm receded. Not because it lost its fury, but because it had changed the land it struck. What remained was not ruin, but redefinition. Lucille Garner, once pushed aside like dust, now stood in history's light, not as a victim, but as the moment silence ended and the system had to listen. The sound in the federal hearing chamber wasn't silence, it was a pressure system. It was breath held in hundreds of lungs, shoes scuffed softly across marble, 100 eyelids resisting the impulse to blink at the wrong moment. This wasn't a courtroom of noise. It was a theater of restraint, and at center stage sat Kyle Renner, no longer in uniform, stripped of his badge but still trying to wear the arrogance like a second skin. He sat flanked by attorneys, fingers tapping a rhythm of shallow control on the wooden table before him. Lights were bright, not warm, clinical, like an operating room where justice was the scalpel. Across the chamber, Malcolm Garner sat still, hands folded, spine straight. His calmness, not the absence of fury, but the discipline of it. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the press. He looked at Kyle, and only Kyle. The chair creaked as Kyle leaned forward to speak, his voice low and gravelly at first, a forced calm like a bomb technician trying to diffuse public opinion. "I followed protocol," he began, eyes scanning for sympathetic faces that didn't exist. "I followed orders. I did what was expected of me in a high-pressure situation." A congresswoman on the oversight committee tilted her head slightly, unimpressed, and dragging a 76-year-old woman down a bank lobby floor was part of that protocol, she asked, her voice sharp but smooth, like a razor dipped in ice water. Kyle's jaw clenched. She was obstructing service and refusing to comply. Noncompliance has consequences. Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He let Kyle dig the grave with his tongue. "What would you say," another committee member asked, "to the claim that your tone, your language, your treatment of Mrs. Garner demonstrated not just force, but contempt?" Kyle bristled. "That's your interpretation. I treated her no differently than anyone else who obstructed a financial institution's operations." He emphasized the term like it was a criminal indictment, not a grandmother confused over paperwork. She wasn't special. Malcolm's gaze was steady. He didn't blink. But inside, a match caught flame. The chairwoman cleared her throat. "We received a transcript from a previous internal meeting. It appears you once said, and I quote, 'These people only learn when you press them against the wall.' Is that accurate?" Kyle shifted in his seat. His lawyer leaned in, but Kyle waved him off. "That comment was taken out of context," he said. "It was about maintaining order. Sometimes you have to make an example to instill fear," the chairwoman cut in, "because that's what it sounds like, Mr. Renner. Fear. Not discipline, not professionalism, fear." The air in the room condensed. Cameras clicked. Pens stopped moving. Malcolm leaned back slightly, like he could already smell the confession in the air. Then Kyle broke. He didn't scream. He barked. "You want the truth? I kept the streets clean. I dealt with the people no one else wanted to deal with. You sit in your ivory towers and write memos while I bled on sidewalks you've never walked. You don't understand what it's like when they spit in your face and laugh at your authority. They don't listen. They don't obey. They don't fear. So yeah, I made them feel it. That's what works. That's what keeps them in line." Gasps rippled. Phones raised. The room froze around the molten center of his words, and Malcolm spoke, finally, one sentence, crisp. "Sir, thank you, Mr. Renner," he said, standing without urgency. "You just signed your indictment." Lucille, seated just behind her son, didn't move, but her fingers, which had been resting quietly on her lap, curled slowly into fists, not of violence, but of affirmation. The committee didn't need to respond. They knew. Everyone in that room knew. This wasn't a defense. It was a meltdown in real time, a man unraveling not from pressure, but from finally being seen without his armor. The weight of Kyle's outburst didn't collapse the room in chaos. It crystallized it. No one moved. No one spoke. It was the silence of finality, the kind that followed an explosion too clear, too damning to require clarification. The panel of congressional investigators exchanged no words, only glances, the type of glances that said, "This hearing just shifted from review to reckoning." Kyle sat back, suddenly aware of the echo of his voice still lingering in the chamber like smoke. His attorney leaned in, whispering something sharp and fast, but Kyle didn't hear it. He was too busy replaying his own words in his head, the adrenaline that pushed them out now retreating, leaving behind only dread. Across the room, Malcolm didn't move a muscle. He didn't need to. His work was no longer in his voice. It had moved into gravity, and Kyle was caught in its pull. The chairwoman straightened a file on the table with unnecessary precision. "Let the record show that Mr. Renner's own words reflect a conscious philosophy of enforcement through intimidation and humiliation. This is not about isolated behavior anymore. This is about intent." Kyle tried to speak, then thought better. His mouth hung open for a moment, then closed. Even he realized now that silence was safer. A younger congressman spoke next, his voice quiet but firm. "You say you kept the streets clean. But whose streets, Mr. Renner? Because to many Americans, the streets you patrolled feel more like open-air cages than neighborhoods. You turned fear into policy. You turned compliance into performance. And today, for the first time, you're being asked to explain it without your badge to hide behind." Kyle's hands trembled under the table. He gripped the underside of his seat, grounding himself. Behind him, rows of onlookers stared, not with anger, but with something worse, certainty. Malcolm finally turned slightly, facing the panel. His voice was low, confident, stripped of theatrics. The video was not the worst of it. It was not what he did that night. It's what he believes when he does it. That mindset isn't an accident. It's training. It's an endorsement. It's permission disguised as discipline. One of the panelists nodded slowly. "Systemic complicity," she said, almost to herself. The phrase hung in the air, sharp as glass. That term, first coined by journalists in the wake of Lucille's arrest, now sat officially in the federal record, a knife carved into the wood of the system Kyle once relied on to protect him. Another question was posed, softer, deadlier. "Mr. Renner, are you aware of the number of complaints filed against you over the past 9 years?" He cleared his throat, jaw flexing. "A few, some were investigated, all dismissed." The congressman slid a document forward. 18. Only 2 were revered with internal interviews. None resulted in action. One involved a pregnant woman being threatened at gunpoint. Her statement was sealed without follow-up. Kyle's pupils shrank. That was cleared. That wasn't what it looked like. It looked like fear, Malcolm said. And fear doesn't lie. The room recoiled quietly from his words, not because they were too dramatic, but because they were too familiar. Lucille sat steadily. No tears, no outburst, but her chin lifted slightly, the kind of gesture that could shatter decades of erasure with just millimeters of motion. "Let's move on," said the chairwoman. But no one truly had to. The point had been scorched into the moment. The third hour of the hearing opened like a wound that refused to close. The longer Kyle sat there, the smaller he became, not in stature but in presence. His confidence, once loud enough to fill a room, now curled into itself like ash. He no longer answered questions with indignation. He recited them like a prisoner pacing his cell, knowing each step was being watched and measured. His voice had lost its blade. His sentences were now sandbags, heavy, slow, and futile against the rising flood of evidence. The room shifted focus. Kyle was no longer the only thing on trial. The questions became broader, pointed upward and outward. "How many officers in your department share Mr. Renner's outlook?" one committee member asked. "How many training programs reinforce this adversarial approach to public interaction?" Another chimed in. "How does a man with this many complaints, this many red flags, stay in uniform for nearly a decade without review?" A federal policy advisor, brought in as a witness, replied coldly. Because the system wasn't designed to intervene. It was designed to absorb, to contain, not correct. And in men like Mr. Renner, that containment became confidence. Malcolm watched it unfold like someone studying the final moments before a building collapsed, stone by stone, support by support. He did not interrupt. He didn't need to. Kyle was now testifying not just for himself, but as Exhibit A of everything that allowed him to exist, unchecked. Kyle's hands had stopped moving. His jaw hung slightly open, eyes glassy. His lawyer passed him a note, but he didn't read it. He just stared at the table, the wood grain more comforting than the cameras. And yet, even as the structure cracked around him, Kyle flinched at one name, Lucille. The chairwoman referenced her gently. "We remind the chamber," she said, "that this entire investigation began with the treatment of a single individual, Mrs. Lucille Garner. The images of her arrest became a turning point, not because they were unprecedented, but because they were irrefutable. She wasn't a threat, she was an emblem, and she was treated like a problem." The murmur moved through the room. Kyle looked up. For a moment, he seemed to want to speak, to apologize perhaps, but nothing came. His mouth opened, then shut, a rhythm of cowardice and calculation. In that flicker, he realized, even if he found the right words, no one would believe he meant them. Then Malcolm stood. Permission had not been requested, but it wasn't necessary. The committee leaned back. They wanted to hear him. "My mother," Malcolm began, voice smooth as stone, "did not want to become a symbol. She did not want her face on billboards, her name in newspapers. She wanted her dignity at a bank counter, and she was denied that, not by accident, not in confusion, but with deliberate humiliation." He paused, and yet she endured. She did not curse, she did not strike back, she did not crumble, because her power does not come from privilege or position. It comes from knowing who she is, and that, Mr. Renner, is what you feared most. Not her age, not her body, her unshakable sense of self. Kyle twitched. Just once, the words hit harder than handcuffs ever could. No one breathed when Malcolm sat down, not even the press. What he had said wasn't a statement. It was a verdict dressed in restraint. The kind of truth that didn't raise its voice because it didn't need to. It was already written into the silence. Kyle stared forward. He didn't blink. He didn't shake his head. But in his stillness, something collapsed. The self-piece of him he clung to, the protector, the enforcer, the man who kept the city in line, that version of himself had been peeled away, layer by layer, until all that was left was a uniform without integrity, a voice without echo. And then the final blow landed. A congressional aide walked up to the committee bench with a flash drive. The chairwoman received it, her expression unreadable. "We've just received a leak from an anonymous source," she said into the mic, "an internal audio clip from a department training session last year." She pressed play. The speakers crackled before Kyle's voice filled the chamber, low but clear. "They don't respect a badge," it said, "until it breaks their will." The room stiffened. A few reporters gasped. Someone at the back muttered, "Jesus." But Malcolm said nothing. He simply turned, just slightly, to watch Kyle's face. Kyle looked stunned, then defensive, then broken. "That's out of context," he muttered, but no one responded. The chairwoman didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. "It's in your voice, Officer Renner. Your context is clear." She paused. "And your context is the problem." Then, finally, the spotlight shifted. In the back row, Lucille Garner sat motionless. Her hands were still folded, her body still upright, but her eyes, God, her eyes, were alive with something far stronger than vengeance. They held a legacy, defiance, proof that even when ignored, even when diminished, dignity waits like a seed under frost, waiting for sunlight, waiting for this. Malcolm turned toward her, not with a smile, not with celebration, but with acknowledgement, as if to say, "We're almost there." The chairwoman looked toward Kyle one last time. "This hearing is adjourned." she said. "Further action will be pursued under federal recommendation." The gavel fell, but Kyle didn't rise. He sat there, alone, eyes fixed on the table in front of him like it might still save him. No cuffs yet, no sentence, but the judgment had been delivered, not by law, by truth. And truth, when finally spoken, weighs everything Kyle once thought he controlled. As the crowd began to exit, reporters scrambling to file live updates, Lucille remained. She didn't rush. She didn't blink. She just let the room empty around her. For the first time, no one looked past her. They looked at her. They saw her. And that was the start of justice. The room hadn't fully settled from the tremor of Kyle Renner's involuntary confession. The viral clip was still ricocheting through media cycles, its silence heavier than outrage, its impact deeper than 1,000 speeches. But before the dust could even collect, another rupture cracked through the veneer. Not from a courtroom, not from Malcolm's voice, but from the yellowed pages of a forgotten archive. It arrived not like a gavel, but like a fingerprint, a trace of history pressed into paper. The headline was deceptively unassuming. "Complaint dismissed in Officer Renner's domestic matter." Buried in column 5, paragraph 3, was a quote so ordinary it almost didn't sting. "He said if I ever told anyone, no one would believe me, that he was a cop, that he could make the report disappear, and he had." Malcolm Garner didn't enter the press room like a man hunting justice. He entered like a man offering it. He carried no bulging binder, no angry bullet points, no team of handlers. Only a folded newspaper, thin and sharp, and a gaze that refused to blink. The press bristled with anticipation, cameras hungry, flashes twitching. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam fists or demand outrage. Instead, he unfolded the newspaper, laid it on the podium with surgical care, and turned it toward the crowd like a page of scripture. "This article," he said, voice like tempered steel, "was published 6 years ago. A single report, filed, then buried. No follow-up, no hearing, no accountability." He didn't look down. He didn't need to. It was dismissed because the officer involved was deemed too valuable to scrutinize, because his record would be stained, because morale might be affected. He let the words hang. So instead, they chose to ignore someone's bruises, someone's voice, someone's warning. The projector behind him flicked on. A scanned copy of the original complaint filled the screen, crisp and undeniable. The name on the report, Melissa Renner. Her statement was concise, devastating. Allegations of repeated physical intimidation, emotional coercion, and threats of career destruction if she went public. But what screamed louder than her words was the handwritten note at the bottom of the internal memo. Given Officer Renner's commendations and leadership potential, no further action recommended. The silence in the room wasn't passive. It was surgical, dissecting every syllable, and Malcolm knew it. "This is not about a divorce," he continued, eyes never straying. "This is about power unchecked. A man trusted to enforce the law, whose violence was documented and still dismissed because his badge was considered more sacred than her safety." At that moment, Kyle Renner stormed through the side door, face flushed, posture erratic. He wasn't the composed officer anymore. He was sweating and panicked and unraveling pride. "This is irrelevant," he shouted, spit catching the light. "It's personal. It has nothing to do with what happened at that bank." Malcolm turned, slow and steady, like a tide that doesn't need to rise quickly to drown you. "And that," he said, calm as winter glass, "is exactly the problem. You think your violence lives in separate rooms. You think what you do at home has no bearing on the badge you wear, but it does. It's the same hand, the same fist, the same disregard." Kyle's lips curled, but his jaw trembled. "So now I'm on trial for a failed marriage? For hearsay?" Malcolm didn't blink. "You're not on trial, Officer Renner. Not yet. You're being seen for the first time, fully." He stepped aside, allowing the image of the complaint to loom larger behind him. "This is not an isolated incident. This is a thread in a tapestry of rot." Reporters surged forward. "Mr. Garner, do you believe the department covered this up? Will you pursue this legally?" "Do you believe there are more victims?" Malcolm didn't answer with fury. He answered with a question. How many other files like this are in drawers labeled "Do Not Disturb"? How many truths are we too afraid to read because they indict not just a man, but a system that protected him? Kyle stepped forward, trying to seize the newspaper from the podium, but his hands shook. His fingers fumbled over the page, crumpling it slightly before recoiling as if it burned him. He turned to the cameras, desperate. "This is character assassination. You people want to ruin everything I built over one mistake." Malcolm tilted his head. "Mistakes don't file restraining orders. Patterns do." A reporter in the back asked, "Do you deny the allegations in your ex-wife's report, officer?" Kyle's mouth opened, then closed. "She was unstable. She had issues. She twisted things." Another voice cut in, sharper. "Was the complaint false?" He hesitated. His chest rose and fell like someone drowning in air. "No comment," he said finally. "No comment is not silence. It is surrender." By evening, the story had metastasized. News outlets ran dual images. One, Kyle dragging Lucille Garner by her wrist. The other, a scanned photo labeled Exhibit B, a woman's forearm bruised in the shape of fingers. Twitter lit up with the new tag. He did it then too. One advocacy group posted, "This isn't history repeating. This is history resurfacing." Kyle sat in his office, face illumined by screenlight, reading every article with eyes that refused to understand. His name wasn't trending because he lost his temper. It was trending because people finally realized he never had control to begin with, only permission. He threw his phone. The crash didn't make him feel better. He stood in front of the mirror, jaw set, veins throbbing. "They don't know me," he muttered. "They don't know what I've done for this damned city." But the mirror offered no validation, only reflection. And reflection is cruel when the costume no longer fits. In another room, Malcolm folded the newspaper again, the crease straight, deliberate. He didn't keep it as a trophy. He kept it as a record. Because the truth doesn't expire, and justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. And this time, it was. On the page, in the pixel, in the quiver of a man's voice when his armor begins to peel. Kyle could scream, not related at all he wanted, but his fingerprints were everywhere. On the page, on the bruise, on the badge, on the silence, and this time, someone finally touched the ink. The ink hadn't dried on the headlines from the morning before the next wave hit, not with fury, but with the quiet force of something undeniable. It came not through another testimony or legal motion, but through an image, a still frame. 1 second caught forever, and somehow it spoke louder than every speech that had come before it. Malcolm Garner entered the hearing room with a manila envelope, expression unreadable, steps deliberate. He did not bring fire, he brought a mirror. The room had changed. The air wasn't just tense, it was restrained, like a breath held too long. Those seated inside knew they had crossed the point where this was merely about an officer. Now it was about an unraveling, about whether truth could cut through stone. As Malcolm approached the podium, he paused, removed the photo from the envelope, and placed it gently on the projector tray without a word. It appeared on the screen, large, brutal, irrefutable. Lucille Garner, being pushed into the back seat of a patrol car. Her head bowed, her hair was tangled, one shoe missing. Her right leg was dragging behind her like a forgotten limb. The expression on her face wasn't pain, it was erasure, not fear, but the absence of acknowledgement. She was not screaming, she was not pleading, she was simply unseen. A gasp rippled through the room. One hand rose to a mouth. A pencil snapped in half. No one moved. Then came the video. Malcolm pressed play. The clip was short, no audio, no filter. Just Kyle Renner in uniform, standing above a restrained elderly woman whose wrists had already been tied. And then, with cold precision, he placed his boot on her wrist, not stamping, not slamming, but pinning, as if testing how much weight it would take to silence her. The movement was casual, mechanical, like he'd done it before. The room didn't erupt, it collapsed. One senator stood, barely able to raise his voice. I I will not watch another second of this." He left. No words, no press statement, only the sound of his shoes echoed across the marble as he exited the chamber. Kyle shifted in his seat, arms crossed tighter than armor. His lips pursed, jaw clenched, eyes flicking toward the screen, then away. "That angle is misleading," he muttered. "You can't see what happened. The footage is blurry." Malcolm didn't respond immediately. He let the image linger, let the audience sit in it, let every blinking light of every camera absorb what silence was doing. Then, with a tone flat as iron, he said, "Sin doesn't need high definition. It only needs to be seen." Kyle scoffed. "You think you're righteous because you found an old clip? You think you've exposed something new? You've never worn the badge. You don't know what it takes to keep order." Malcolm looked at him. Not with rage, but with something deeper, a stillness that made the room lean closer. "I know what it takes to dehumanize. And what does it cost when it's exposed?" He turned back to the gallery. "This image is not just about a man stepping on a wrist. It's about a system that taught him it was fine to do so, and worse, that no one would care." The projection remained, looming over them like a judgment from above. Lucille's posture, the indifference of the officer beside her, the way her foot curled unnaturally, dragging from the weight of years. This was not a moment of loss. It was a moment of truth finally developing in public light. No one dared breathe too loudly. A woman in the back wiped her eye. Another scribbled something on a notepad, unable to look up. The image did not scream. It didn't need to. It whispered, and the whisper was enough to shatter decorum. Kyle broke the silence, with a voice too loud, too strained, too late. "You're turning this into theater. You want me to be the villain because you need a story. You think that's justice?" Malcolm's answer was softer than expected. "No," he said, "I don't need to make you the villain. You already auditioned for the part. I'm just holding up the photo." And the room absorbed it again. This wasn't exaggeration. It was evidence. It was physical. It was undeniable. And Kyle Renner, in that instant, was no longer just a man defending himself. He was a man cornered by what he could no longer explain away. In homes across the country, that image played again and again. On phones, on TVs, on tablets propped up in kitchens. No loud anchors were narrating. No music, just the silent pause before the frame appeared. A woman, a wrist, a boot, a question. How many times had this happened where there were no cameras? How many wrists had been stepped on without leaving a mark, except in memory? Malcolm left the chamber without another word. He had said enough. More importantly, he had shown enough. And in cases like this, what's shown cannot be unsaid. Behind him, Kyle sat still, his hands twitching. His lawyer whispered something, but Kyle didn't seem to hear. His eyes were fixed on the frozen frame still glowing on the wall. Not just the image of a woman he tried to silence, but the image that would define him forever. Not the badge, not the record, that photo. Outside, reporters swarmed. But Malcolm raised one hand, palm out, not to push them back, but to pause the noise. "Ask yourselves," he said quietly, "if that was your mother in that car, what would you want to happen next?" He walked away before they could answer. He didn't need their voices. The image was already speaking for itself, and the world, for once, was listening. The photo still lingered in the air like smoke, its silence louder than any verdict. But just as the room began to process the weight of what it had seen, just as some returned to notes and whispers and the illusion of composure, the doors opened again, slowly, deliberately, as if held by time itself. A man entered. He didn't carry files. He wasn't flanked by lawyers. He didn't wear a suit polished for performance. His uniform was a memory. His presence was history. He moved like someone who had once belonged inside these chambers but had chosen exile. A cane in one hand, a badge worn down by years rather than polish, and eyes that didn't scan for approval. He wasn't here for drama. He was here for debt. The murmurs were immediate. Some recognized him. Others only sensed the shift in temperature. Malcolm turned, and for a rare moment his expression broke. Not surprise, not concern, but recognition. Not of a threat, but of weight. The man nodded once toward the judge, then cleared his throat. It wasn't strong, it wasn't rehearsed, but it carried. "My name," he said, steady as weathered oak, "is Thomas Braddock. I served 32 years in this department. I trained more than 200 officers. One of them was Kyle Renner." A low ripple passed through the room. Kyle, seated like a stone just below the surface, tightened his jaw. His eyes darted, but his posture held. Thomas didn't look at him. Not yet. He kept his focus ahead, speaking not to the room, but through it. "When I trained Kyle, I told him that order without compassion is just control. I told him that the badge doesn't give you the right to dominate. It gives you the burden to protect those who can't protect themselves." Now he turned. Kyle didn't meet his gaze. He tried, but something in his bones flinched. "I watched him graduate with honors," Thomas continued, voice not angry, but hollowed out by disappointment. "He was sharp, he was quick, but somewhere between the classroom and the cruiser, he learned a different lesson, one I didn't teach. The silence in the courtroom had changed. It wasn't the suspense of a verdict. It was the kind of silence that fills funerals, not of people, but of ideals. Thomas exhaled. "You see, I believed that if I said the right things enough times, they'd stick. If I led with an example, the young ones would follow. But some men don't follow. They watch, they mimic, and they twist." He walked forward, slow but certain, and placed a folded sheet of paper on the witness table. Not evidence, not a statement, just a note, a record from his training log. The day Kyle passed his ethics exam with full marks. "I kept that for years," Thomas said, more to himself than anyone, as proof I was making good men. Turns out I was just making competent ones. There's a difference. Kyle's lips parted, barely. No sound came. His hands, clenched so long, trembled now, not from fury but from something colder, exposure. Then Thomas turned toward Malcolm, and the moment pivoted. "You," he said gently, "didn't win today just because your mother was mistreated. You won because you did something I didn't do. You stood up while others sat down. You forced this room to look. And for the ones I failed to stand up for when I should have, today I owe them a voice." Malcolm didn't move, but something in his presence deepened, like an anchor lowered rather than a flag raised. Thomas looked back at the bench. What Kyle did was his own doing. But what do we allow? That's on all of us. And silence is no longer a defense. He stepped down. No fanfare, no applause, just a long walk back toward the gallery, where he sat alone, not as a hero, not as a traitor, but as a man who had finally spoken. Kyle's face had changed. The color drained, the mask cracked, because it wasn't the law that had indicted him this time. It wasn't even the public. It was someone who once believed in him, and that kind of judgment doesn't show up on transcripts. It shows up in memory. Outside, the headlines wrote themselves. "Veteran officer testifies against former student. I failed to unteach him." But inside, the room remained hushed, because what Thomas Braddock had delivered wasn't just testimony, it was legacy undone, a quiet confession from a generation that raised Kyle and now saw its reflection in the damage. And when the judge called for recess, no one rushed to stand. They sat with it, with the weight, with the reckoning, because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that shifts the room, it's the oldest, and the one that finally, after years of stillness, decides to speak. The room hadn't yet recovered from the quiet thunder of Thomas Braddock's confession. When the next name was called, it was not shouted. It was not echoed by murmurs or shifting papers. It was spoken with care, and in that stillness it landed heavier than a gavel. Mrs. Lucille Garner. She rose slowly, not because she was frail, though the years had certainly carved their weight into her bones, but because this moment did not deserve haste. She walked to the witness stand with measured dignity, a woman carrying not just her story but the silence of many who had never been heard. Every step was a defiance against being forgotten. Every pause a reminder that dignity does not require speed. The clerk asked the formal questions. She responded with a voice soft but firm, like gravel under silk. Then, for the first time since her name had become a headline, Lucille Garner faced the room, and the room forgot how to breathe. "I've lived 76 years," she began, eyes steady, hands folded in front of her. "I've seen cities burn and flowers bloom. I've held my baby through fever nights and buried friends who never made it past their 30s. I've stood in lines that bent around blocks just to vote and sat on buses where I was told my seat didn't belong to me. But nothing prepared me for the day I realized people would still look through me, not at me, through me." Her gaze moved, not over the crowd but into it, as if she could see the thoughts hiding behind every tie, every polished shoe, every mask of professionalism. "You call it an incident, a mistake, a lapse, but to me it was Tuesday. It was routine, not because I accepted it, but because I've learned that some men don't see women like me as real." She let that settle, then continued. "I don't need your pity. I don't want your hand on my shoulder, or your hashtags, or your speeches about how far we've come. I need you to see me, not as a victim, not as someone's mother, but as a person. Because on that day, in that bank, I wasn't a citizen, I wasn't a customer, I wasn't even a woman. I was a problem." She turned her head, just slightly, toward Kyle Renner. Her eyes didn't tremble, her mouth didn't tighten, her voice didn't rise. "He didn't ask my name, he didn't ask what I needed, he didn't even look at my face. He grabbed my wrist like it was a handle. He spoke to me like I was a dog that had stayed too long on someone else's porch, and he smiled." The last word cut deeper than any raised tone could have. That smile, Kyle's practiced smirk, his casual disregard, his professional cruelty, suddenly became monstrous under the weight of recollection. Lucille continued. "That smile wasn't about the law. It wasn't about order. It was about power. It said, 'You are nothing, and I will remind you of that before lunch.'" Kyle shifted. For the first time in days, he looked older, smaller, not cornered, but pierced. "I have lived long enough," Lucille said, "to know the difference between a man doing his job and a man enjoying it. He enjoyed it. That moment when my arm twisted behind my back, when my papers hit the floor, when I gasped, not out of pain, but out of disbelief. That moment fed something in him. The judge didn't interrupt, the counsel didn't object. The room had become her courtroom now. "I am not here to cry," she said, her voice now barely above a whisper, but sharper than any blade. "I have cried in private enough to drown this building. I am not here to collapse, or tremble, or make you feel sorry. I am here to ask you to remember what it looks like when a human being is treated like trash, and to tell you this was not the first time, and if nothing changes, it will not be the last." Then, for one final time, she turned to the gallery, not to her son, not to her tormentor, but to the people who could no longer pretend they hadn't seen. "He didn't know my name because he didn't think I deserved one. But you, now you do, so say it. Say my name when you leave this building. Say it when you talk to your children about justice. Say it when you vote, when you protest, when you sleep at night and wonder if you did enough. I am Lucille Garner. I am not someone's mistake. I am not someone's footnote. I am not a burden you get to ignore." And with that, she stepped down. No applause came. None was needed. But slowly, like trees bending toward first light, people stood, one by one, silent, upright, awakened. A senator rose, then a journalist, then a bailiff, then a woman who had come just to observe, but found her own grandmother's story written in Lucille's voice. Kyle remained seated, but his stillness no longer looked like discipline. It looked like defeat. Not because he had lost the case, there was still more trial ahead, but because the one person he'd stepped on had risen above him without ever raising her hand. Outside, the headline had already been written by 1,000 hearts. She didn't ask for justice, she demanded recognition. And inside, the echo of her words stayed behind like the scent of fire, bitter, lingering, unforgettable. The courtroom still held the shadow of Lucille Garner's voice, like the trace of heat after a long fire. But beyond those walls, Beyond applause withheld, beyond silence earned, there was something else rising. Not from the front page, not from podiums or protests, from inboxes, from trembling hands, from letters never meant to be mailed but sent anyway. Malcolm Garner didn't sleep that night. Not because he couldn't, but because the world had finally decided to speak. His email inbox blinked like a pulse. His voicemail filled. His assistant stopped printing after the stack passed 4 inches. It was no longer about one case. It was no longer about one wrist, one woman, one video. This was what silence looks like when it breaks. Some messages were anonymous. Some were signed with initials. Others with full names followed by, "I'm ready now." The language varied, some short, clinical, others weeping between words. But every line carried the same wound. Kyle Renner's name returned over and over, not as a badge number, but as a shadow burned into memory. One photo came in a brown envelope. No return address, no note, just an image that refused to stay silent. A pregnant woman in a parking lot, both hands raised, Kyle's arms stretched out, pistol locked, the muzzle pointed directly at her belly. The timestamp confirmed what the sun in the frame already told. It was noon, middle of the day, middle of the world watching, and no one had stopped it. The story followed hours later in an email written like a confession. She hadn't heard the command. English wasn't her first language. She had turned, startled, hand halfway to her pocket. Kyle didn't shoot, but he grinned. The witness who took the photo had never sent it to anyone, until now. Malcolm stared at it too long, not in disbelief, but in calculation. He knew what this image could do. He knew the fire could light, but he also knew what it would burn. Privacy, dignity, healing. Some truth is too sacred to weaponize. So he did what justice required, not what vengeance begged. He compiled every image, every affidavit, every typed and handwritten letter, and placed them into folders. Black, unmarked, methodical. He labeled them with dates, locations, patterns. He didn't react to pain, he preserved it. Then he handed it all, not to the press, not to the cameras, but to the federal prosecutor. A quiet room, a single desk, one man, one woman, one exchange. The evidence crossed the table like a silent indictment of everything that had been allowed to grow in darkness. Malcolm didn't say much. He didn't have to. "This isn't a case," he said softly. "It's a pattern, and now it's your responsibility." The prosecutor nodded once. No bravado, no promises, just gravity. Back in his office, Malcolm sat alone, the envelope still in his hands. Not the one with the photo. He'd sealed that already. But another, unopened, postmarked 3 days prior. Inside, a child's drawing, shakily scrawled. A figure in blue, a stick figure crying, a black line across a face, and below it 5 words. "He pushed my mommy down, no return address." Just a child. Malcolm didn't cry. He didn't break. But something inside him shifted. The kind of shift you don't recover from because you're not supposed to. Kyle Renner didn't know about the folders. Not yet. But he would. Not from a headline, from a subpoena, from a federal order that doesn't ask, it demands, because the time for permission had passed. This wasn't vengeance. This wasn't a spectacle. This was evidence. And every photo, every letter, every voice no longer shaking in fear but steady in truth, had now been placed into the one courtroom Kyle could not walk out of with a smirk. There would be no press release. No televised moment, just the cold mechanics of accountability, and this time no one would look away. The folders had been delivered. The silence had been broken. Now the reckoning had arrived. Not with sirens, not with screaming crowds or breaking news banners, but with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of legal breath held before the fall. The courtroom felt colder than usual that morning, though the air conditioning hadn't changed. Perhaps it was something else, the anticipation, the finality, or simply the absence of denial left to cling to. Kyle Renner sat between his attorneys, arms stiff at his sides, face locked in a mask that had long since lost its authority. His uniform was gone. his tie is crooked. His badge now belonged to memory and regret. This wasn't the man who had once barked orders in hallways or sneered at vulnerability with polished boots on polished floors. This was a man cornered not by bars, but by truths too sharp to escape. The judge read the sentence slowly, clearly, with no emphasis. No pity, just the architecture of law doing what it had failed to do for years. Mr. Kyle Renner. The voice rang, precise as a blade. This court finds you guilty of sustained misconduct under federal civil rights statutes. Your law enforcement certification is hereby permanently revoked. You are sentenced to 5 years in federal custody. Additionally, you are ordered to pay $12 million in civil damages to the plaintiffs listed. There was no gasp, no outcry, just stillness. Kyle's reaction came delayed, as though the words took time to detonate inside him. First, his jaw tensed, then his fingers curled, then his voice cracked the silence with a sound more pitiful than powerful. "You don't know what I gave," he screamed, rising as if the sheer volume might buy him mercy. "You don't understand what I sacrificed. I kept the streets clean. I followed orders. But the courtroom didn't answer. Not the judge, not the gallery, not even his lawyers. His words hung in the air, limp and self-consuming. It was not a protest. It was a whimper disguised as outrage. The bailiff stepped forward, one hand hovering near his holster. Not out of fear, but protocol. Kyle didn't resist. His body collapsed back into the chair, breathing shallow, eyes darting in every direction for a shred of affirmation that no longer existed. The judge cleared his throat but didn't speak again. There was nothing more to say. Malcolm Garner sat still, his expression unreadable, his posture unchanged. He did not gloat. He did not nod. He simply watched as justice did its work, not loud, not flashy, but final. For him, it was not a moment of celebration. It was acknowledgement, cold, long overdue, and necessary. Lucille Garner was not in the room. She had chosen not to attend the sentencing. Her absence said more than her presence ever could. She had already delivered her judgment. The system was only now catching up. As Kyle was escorted out, he passed by the empty seat he had occupied throughout the trial, and when the doors closed behind him, that chair remained, untouched, unclaimed, unredeemed. The room looked at it the way one looks at a battlefield after the last shot, not with triumph, but with reverence for what will never be undone. That seat didn't belong to him anymore. It belonged to every story he had silenced, to every bruise buried in files, to every name forgotten until now, and so it remained there, in plain view, long after the crowd left, long after the cameras stopped, long after the sentence was entered into the record books. A chair, vacant, still, watched. Kyle Renner no longer had a seat in power, or in uniform, or even in the memory of those who once excused him. All he had now was a number, a record, a history, rewritten not by spin, but by consequence, and no one stood to offer him sympathy. No one called out. No one reached for his shoulder. Justice had arrived, not with vengeance, not with applause, but with a chair left empty, and a man who had nowhere left to sit. The chair remained empty, but outside the courtroom something far more lasting had begun to fill the silence. Not noise, not headlines, not outrage or applause, just a shift, the kind that can't be measured by law or money or even punishment, but by something older, something sacred, the restoration of dignity. When the networks called, Malcolm Garner declined. CNN, MSNBC, public radio, late-night shows, they all asked for a statement, a reaction, a reflection. He said no to all of them, not out of contempt, but because some stories didn't need more words. They needed fewer assumptions. His answer was simple. "My mother doesn't need me to speak for her," he said. "She just needs people to say her name correctly." That was all. And yet, it was everything. The media, left with nothing but silence, did what they always do when denied access. They reached for archives, for angles, for meaning. Their search began with satellite vans and ended in coffee shops, in barber shops, and on street corners, where names are remembered longer than elected terms. They tracked down former classmates, old neighbors, people who once shook hands with Kyle Renner and now refused to say they had. In a diner in Queens, a waitress recalled the day Kyle walked in during the height of the trial, and no one stood to serve him. A cook leaned out from the kitchen, wiped his hands, and said flatly, "We don't feed men who think silence is a right." It wasn't yelled, it wasn't recorded, but someone wrote it on the receipt and posted it online. And by midnight it had become a statement stronger than any editorial. A week later, a gym rescinded Kyle's membership, not by letter, not with ceremony, but with absence. His key card stopped working. The front desk never explained. When he asked, the young woman behind the counter just handed him a printed copy of the gym's mission statement and said, "We protect bodies, not reputations." The paper trembled in his hand, but she didn't. Far away, in a suburban school district where Kyle once volunteered for Career Day, his photo was quietly removed from the hallway mural of community mentors. The blank space was left untouched, unpainted, its emptiness more visible than any portrait could have been. A fourth grader walked past and asked the principal, "Wasn't that the man with the shiny badge?" The principal didn't lie. "He was," she replied, then pointed to the new frame being hung next to it. Mrs. Lucille Garner, reading to a classroom, her glasses low on her nose. Every child looking up. But perhaps the most jarring moment came not from subtraction, but from confrontation. At a gas station outside Syracuse, a teenager, barely old enough to vote, recognized Kyle, walked up and asked, "Do you still think you're the good guy?" There was no camera, no script, no crowd, just a question sharpened by history and handed to a man who no longer had a place to put it. Kyle didn't answer. He didn't pay for his gas. He got back in his car and drove away. The boy didn't follow. He just pulled out his phone and tweeted the question. It went viral in less than an hour, not because of who he was, but because everyone had been waiting for someone to ask it. Kyle's face, once a symbol of authority, confidence, and control, had become the canvas upon which a nation scribbled its slow reckoning with power misused. But as the reporters sifted through stories and interviews and broken echoes of a man now crumbling under his history, they kept searching for a quote that would explain it all, a phrase, a soundbite, something that could hold everything in one headline. But the story resisted being packaged. It refused to be convenient. It had left the courtroom, but not the conversation. And what they found was not another quote or another photo, but a moment they had missed. It came in a clip only a few seconds long, buried within a longer reel of footage captured after the verdict. A hospital hallway, fluorescent lights, a nurse pushing a wheelchair. In it, Lucille Garner, wrapped in a soft blanket, not frail, not broken, just quiet, composed, watching the world like someone who had finally seen it look back. And then came the voice, gentle, clear, and unremarkable to most. "Are you comfortable, Mrs. Garner?" The nurse didn't flinch. She wasn't performing. She wasn't aware the microphone had picked it up. She was simply doing what should have been done all along. No one called her that woman. No one said her. No one barked instructions or leaned in with condescension. They said her name. It aired once, late at night, barely noticed. But the internet caught it, and what the courts had sentenced, the public now began to heal. The clip spread, not for drama, not for spectacle, but for resonance. It was quite a justice, personal. Comments followed not with rage, but with recognition. One woman wrote, "My grandmother was always sweetie to the nurses, never Mrs. Alvarez." I cried hearing Mrs. Garner. A teacher in Baltimore posted, "I played the clip for my class. We talked about names, about how losing them is the first step to erasure." It wasn't a headline, it was a ripple. Malcolm watched the clip in silence from his office. He didn't smile, he didn't repost it, he didn't quote it. He just leaned back in his chair and whispered to no one in particular, "They finally said it." Because in the end, the fight had never been for spectacle. It had been for something most people don't realize they've lost until it's gone. The right to be called by name. Mrs. Lucille Garner, That name now belonged not just to a case file or a court transcript, but to a culture recalibrating itself. A woman no longer defined by an incident, a voice no longer silenced by uniform or indifference. Her name was back, and this time it was staying. The name had returned, not with fanfare, not with fireworks, but in a single, unembellished sentence spoken by a stranger who meant it. And that was all it took. Not a verdict, not a headline, not a compensation package, just a name spoken with dignity. But for Malcolm Garner, it wasn't the end. It was something quieter, something weightier. A punctuation mark, not of triumph, but of principle. The office was still, the kind of stillness that follows not exhaustion, but clarity. The last of the files sat on his desk, paper corners slightly curled from the weight of weeks, the ink dried, signatures sealed, justice rendered in legal prose. Everything was there. The rulings, the affidavits, the exhibits, the verdict. It could have been closed, framed, preserved, but Malcolm didn't frame it. He didn't mount it on the wall. He didn't send out victory emails or schedule a press conference. Instead, he slid the case folder shut with a single deliberate motion, then reached for the top drawer of his desk. Not the one marked active, the one marked nothing. From it, he pulled a clean sheet of paper. Not a legal template, not a branded header, just blank, white, weighty stock. He didn't type in bold. He didn't adjust margins or worry about spacing. He wrote a single sentence, centered near the top, unpunctuated by title or name, no citation, no reference number. No one has the right to humiliate my mother, not because I am a lawyer, but because she is a human being. He didn't sign it. He didn't initiate it. He didn't even add a date. The truth, he had come to believe, required no timestamp. He fed the page into the printer himself, listened to the gentle hum as it slid back into his hands. Then he stood, moved to the far end of the room, where the wall remained bare, not from neglect, but from intention. There, in silence, he placed the page inside a simple black frame. No glass, no plaque, just wood and white and the words. He mounted it at eye level. No spotlight, no background music, just a single page on a single wall in a room filled with degrees, diplomas, and case victories. And yet this page held more weight than all of them combined. He stepped back, hands by his side, head tilted slightly, not in admiration, in acknowledgement, the kind of acknowledgement one reserves not for achievement, but for truth. Kyle Renner's name would live on in court databases, public records, and news archives, but Lucille Garner's dignity had been written where no law could erase it, and Malcolm didn't need to keep arguing, not anymore. The office door opened slightly. A junior associate peeked in, voice tentative. "There's a call for you from the mayor's office. Something about a commission on department reform. They want you to—" "Later," Malcolm said gently. "Please." The door closed. He sat back down at his desk, leaned forward and looked once more at the framed page. It said everything the court hadn't, everything the law didn't have space for, everything that couldn't be cross-examined or redacted or appealed. It was not a legal precedent. It was a personal truth, and in that truth was a verdict more powerful than any gavel strike, not rendered by a judge, but by a son. And he knew some would walk past it without reading. Others might ask, why no title? Why no stamp? But the ones who understood wouldn't ask, because they would already know. Justice doesn't always arrive with brass plates or Latin phrases. Sometimes it arrives on paper, unstamped, unsigned, undeniable, and it waits quietly until someone dares to read it out loud.